Hello, everyone. Welcome to video 4 of the 2020 Florida MPJE Boot Camp. We're going to start covering chapter 3 today, but before we do that, I do want to go back to one thing in the previous chapter that I didn't mention that I think is important. This is back on page 57 in chapter 2 on the Controlled Substances Act when we were talking about DEA Form 41. So if you have a chance, jump back to page 57 in your book. I forgot to mention at the top of that page, there's a discussion there about when you use the DEA Form 41 for destruction on the premises. It talks about sending a copy of the Form 41 with the drugs you want to destroy to the DEA in advance and getting permission from them. DEA no longer requires that you send and get permission from them to use DEA Form 41. Those corrections are in the update and corrections document on our website. And so I just want to make sure you make note of that and make those changes in your book back in chapter, page 57 on chapter 2. Okay, with that, let's get started with our normal disclaimer. Remember, I don't have any knowledge of questions on the MPJE, and this course is not affiliated with NABP or endorsed by NABP, and all of the material for this course, including the slides, video, and audio, are copyrighted and may not be recorded, reproduced, or stored without permission of Florida pharmacy regulatory advisors. Okay, so we're going to start on chapter 3, and now we're into the specific Florida laws. And when I was putting this book together, I really struggled with how to organize this section of the book, because the Florida laws, to be totally honest with you, are not very well organized. They're kind of all over the place. So instead of just going through the Florida Pharmacy Act and then the rules separately, I didn't think that was a good way to learn the material. So what I tried to do was group things together that are on the same topic. And by doing that, I took information that's in the Florida Pharmacy Act and also the rules adopted by the Board of Pharmacy and tried to put them together. And then I even found sections where multiple rules cover the same topic from different sections. Even though the rules do have headings, we'll talk about in a moment, that seem to be fairly organized, there's a lot of inconsistency and you have to look in multiple places to get things. So I tried to organize this in two ways. What I did for chapter 3 was I went with an overview, talk about who has prescriptive authority, and there's going to be some stuff we've already covered there under the Controlled Substances Act. And then the information about the Board of Pharmacy itself, and all about licensure, all the types of permits and licenses, and how to get your pharmacist license and pharmacy technician licenses, and then all the different types of pharmacy permits. So more of the nuts and bolts of the law. And then in chapter 4, what I tried to do was really pull together things related to pharmacy practice, right? How do these rules impact pharmacy practice? And I did it in specific areas where there are specific rules on community pharmacy practice, institutional pharmacy practice, some things that apply to all types of pharmacy practices. So I think it's a better way to study the material than just trying to read through the actual rules. And I hope you'll find that helpful. So when you look at the laws and the rules to try to study this material, um, the main thing you want to focus on is the Florida Pharmacy Act, which is chapter 465. And I hear people say, you have to read the laws, you have to read the statutes. But in addition to the statute, you also have to read the rules. And there's a difference between a law and a rule. And you don't need to know the difference for the MPJE, because they're going to ask you what the rule, but how to comply with the law. And that includes the rules. But I've talked to students before, and they said, I read through the entire Florida Pharmacy Act, and then I would ask them, what did you read the Board of Pharmacy rules? And they said no. And I'm thinking, well, you're missing a lot there, because generally, the act, remember, is the law that's passed by the state legislature in this case, right? So the Florida legislature passes the Pharmacy Act that creates the Board of Pharmacy, and then the regulatory agency then creates and passes rules or regulations, they're called. And normally the rules and regulations are actually a lot more detailed than the statute. So you have to kind of read both together, and that's why I try to pull these things together. So don't forget about the rules. The rules are found in chapter 64B16. They're all going to start with chapter 64B16, and then you'll see there's a list of them, 26, 27, 28, that they're trying to organize them into topics, and we'll go through some of those. But you're going to see I pull different rules from different sections and different parts of the statute. But don't forget about the rules when you're also studying the actual law. We've already covered Chapter 893, which is the Florida Controlled Substances Act. And then I also recommend you look at, on the bottom of page 91, the Florida Board of Pharmacy website. There's a section there called resources, which got a lot of helpful information. And by the way, the website is floridaspharmacy.com. Kind of an interesting URL for a government website, but it is floridaspharmacy.com. A lot of useful information there about trying to get your license. And I've even picked up some things in there that are not in the rules, but are explanations that can be helpful and maybe helpful for the MPJE as well. So it's worth some time to go through the Florida Board of Pharmacy website as you're putting together your study plan. Okay, so let's talk about prescriptive authority, and we covered some of this under the Controlled Substances Act, but I think it's important to kind of emphasize it again, even related to non-controlled substances. The way I like to think of prescriptive authority is those practitioners who have what I call independent authority and those have dependent authority. Now, those terms don't show up in the actual laws, but in my mind, it's a good way to remember this. If a prescriber has independent prescriptive authority, that means they can prescribe under their own license. They don't have to have anybody supervising them. And in Florida, those practitioners who have independent authority are physicians, both MDs and DOs, and dentists, podiatrists, veterinarians, and optometrists, certified optometrists, but they do have a limited formulary. But their authority is independent. They're not working under the supervision of someone else, but their authority is also limited by the formulary. The ones that have dependent authority that we've talked about previously in the controlled substance chapter are your physician assistants and advanced practice registered nurses. So I listed for you on number 2 there, the rules for physician assistants. And some of the stuff we've gone over already because a lot of the restrictions for physician assistants are related to controlled substances. So some of this information is going to be repeated. But you'll notice on page 92 in number 2B, not only are they restricted to controlled substances for mental health patients, children less than 18 years of age, they also cannot prescribe spinal, general, or epidural anesthetics, and radiographic contrast materials. The controlled substance restrictions for PAs are listed in 2C. We went over those in the controlled substance chapter already. It is important to note, though, in 2D, that in a hospital practice, there really are no limitations because those are not prescriptions; those are medication orders. APRNs on the bottom of page 92 and over 93, those limitations we talked about for APRNs are mainly related to controlled substance restrictions that we already talked about, but I repeated the information here just to be consistent. And we also mentioned the certified optometrists on page 93. They have independent authority, but a limited formulary. And we already talked about the controlled substance items on that formulary. There's only 2 of them. But then what I've done on pages 94 and 95 and over to 96 is actually list the formulary for you. So you can see what type of drugs are on that formulary. I mean, I don't think you would have to memorize every single drug on this list. I would try to do it by categories. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The categories for optometrists are, these are, the first section are for topical ocular agents. So these are eye drops and eye ointments. And they're in categories. They're cycloplegic and mydriatic drugs, anesthetics, antibacterials, antibiotics, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, antihistamines, and antivirals. They can prescribe on page 96 anti-glaucoma agents that are eye drops and eye ointment still, and then a couple of miscellaneous things. And if you turn over to page 97, the formulary then turns to some oral products that they may prescribe. And there are some limitations on those, and we talked about the first ones on page 97 already, and that is if the controlled substances that they can prescribe, and that's tramadol and acetaminophen number 3, Tylenol number 3. The limitation there is they can only do a 72-hour supply, and they also have to consult with a physician. Now, a physician in this case is going to be an ophthalmologist, because the ophthalmologists are the physicians, optometrists are not. So that's the physician that they're talking about consulting with to prescribe those particular drugs. For oral, they can also prescribe some oral antibiotics, just those ones that are listed on page 97. No consultations needed with the physician in those cases, and some oral antivirals. And then for the oral anti-glaucoma agents, again, a 72-hour supply of those 2 drugs listed on the bottom of page 97. So a little bit different when they start doing oral products versus the eye drops and eye ointments and things that you would think an optometrist would be able to prescribe. Okay, we mentioned telehealth earlier in the controlled substance chapter. So just to reemphasize here that controlled substances may not be prescribed via telehealth, but there are some exceptions on numbers 3A through D, psychiatric disorders, inpatient treatment, hospice services, and patients in nursing homes. The next section on page 98 is pharmacist orders for medicinal drugs. This is a law that was passed a long time ago. It actually, when I graduated pharmacy school in Florida, it passed around about that time. And I remember we thought at the time that Florida was going to be the most progressive state because we had pharmacists prescribing. It is pharmacists prescribing, and it is independent authority. But to get the law passed, there are a lot of restrictions in it. And to be honest with you, if you look at the formulary of drugs, which is, we're going to cover it later in chapter 4 because it's really related to the practice of pharmacy. So we'll cover the details in chapter 4, but just realize there is limited, they don't even call it prescriptive authority, they call it pharmacist order for medicinal drugs. And it's not writing a prescription, because you can't write a prescription and have another pharmacy fill it, but it allows you to order certain drugs. And as you'll see, it's not done hardly at all because the drugs are mainly over-the-counter drugs, and there's not a lot of big benefit to it anymore. But just there is slight prescriptive authority for pharmacists for you to dispense the drugs in your own pharmacy. Well, again, we'll cover that in chapter 4. Okay, on the bottom of page 98 and over to 99, I want to talk a little bit about scope of practice, because that is one of the MPJE competency statements. Scope of practice relates to if a practitioner is writing a prescription outside of their scope of practice, then that's not a valid prescription. So some easy examples would be if a dentist is prescribing for something not related to the practice of dentistry. The example I always use in my class is you get a prescription from a dentist for birth control pills. That's probably not a valid prescription because that's outside the scope of practice for dentistry. But you got to, read these questions carefully, and sometimes it requires the pharmacist to use some professional judgment and consult with the prescriber to find out, is this really within the scope of practice? Because you might get things like alprazolam or benzodiazepines from dentists, and you're thinking, what's that have to do with the practice of dentistry? Well, a lot of times they prescribe that before a procedure to calm people down. So that could be a valid prescription. The birth control, probably not, but don't automatically assume that something's outside of scope of practice without seeking more information. So those are pretty easy. The ones you got to be a little bit careful about are when it comes to physicians, scope of practice does not mean outside the area of specialty. So if you are a physician, you are allowed to treat humans, And the fact that you chose to specialize in a particular area of medicine, let's say you're a cardiologist, that doesn't mean you can't prescribe for something unrelated to cardiology. It might be unusual and it might cause you as a pharmacist to question it, but there's nothing per se illegal about that. I think it's more problematic when you have something like a pediatrician treating an adult, you know, and if it's for controlled substance, you definitely want to question that. But there's nothing per se that says that if you're a physician, you decide to specialize, you can't treat another area. There's a great legal case that I use in class on this where it involved a medication error where a pharmacist misread the prescription. And part of the case that the plaintiffs were trying to make was, well, you should have questioned this because I think they dispensed, I want to say tamoxifen when it was for Tambicor, or maybe it was vice versa. And they said, well, what, you know, why would a cardiologist prescribe tamoxifen? And it's true, the pharmacist should have questioned that, and they weren't. They were actually prescribing Tambicor, which I believe is an anti-arrhythmic drug. So, but nothing per se illegal about that situation. All right, self-prescribing and prescribing for family members. This is also in the MPJE competency statements. And this one's a little bit more difficult because you'd be surprised to find that there's not a specific law that strictly prohibits this. But to be legitimate, a prescription has got to be issued for a legitimate medical purpose and in the usual course of professional practice. And in that usual course of professional practice means basically that you keep records for that patient and you see that patient. So this is, so what falls outside of that would be, you know, a physician writing a prescription for a friend of theirs out on the golf course, right? That's not within the normal scope of professional practice, but you would have to have knowledge of that, obviously, right? And when it comes to self-prescribing, it's generally frowned upon and it's unethical, but Florida doesn't have a strict restriction against that. I will say for controlled substances, it absolutely should not be done, and I would be comfortable saying for a controlled substance, you can, a physician in Florida cannot prescribe a controlled substance for themselves. So for non-controlled substances, it's not as clear, but again, you got to make sure there's a valid doctor-patient relationship and that they are keeping records, and same thing for family members. My wife's actually a physician and, you know, would never prescribe for me because I don't see her in her office. You know, so if that happens once or twice, and it's a non-controlled substance, probably not a big deal. But for MPJE purposes, you want to be kind of strict on this stuff and make sure there's a valid doctor-patient relationship. The next thing on page 99 talks about deceased and retired practitioners. And this is another MPJE competency statement. I will be totally honest with you. I think this is an unfair question on the MPJE in states where it's not specifically addressed. I think in states that address this issue, how to treat a prescription, and it normally comes up with refills, but it could be a new prescription even, where it's a valid prescription at the time it's written, but what happens to that prescription after the practitioner is deceased or retired? Of course, in real life, you'd have to know that the prescriber was deceased or retired, and I guess eventually maybe you'll find out about that. But on the MPJE, they're going to give you a situation where you do have knowledge of that, right? So I said in the book there on page 699, and I still agree with this, you know, my philosophy is always take care of the patient. And if this patient's got a chronic medication they've been on for a long time, then you can provide an emergency refill. We'll talk about emergency refills. You can do that even for controlled substances, not Schedule II, because why? Remember, there's no refills on Schedule II drugs, right? So I think it's a good opportunity to use the emergency refill rules, which we'll cover later, because the emergency refill rules tell you that when you can't get a hold of the physician, you can provide a 72-hour supply. The problem is it's only a 72-hour supply. that may not be enough time for them to find a new doctor. So some states make an exception and say, for this situation, they specifically address it either in their rules or in guidance documents from the Board of Medicine and the Board of Pharmacy. Florida has not chosen to do that. And I would tell you use the emergency refill rules in real life, but my concern is on the MPJE, I don't know what answer they're looking for in a state that puts that question on their exam where the state doesn't address that in a rule. So my best guess, and again, this is just a guess, is their philosophy on the MPJE is a very technical one that says, you know, if a practitioner is deceased or retires, their prescriptions and their refills are no longer valid. Now, again, that's not the best way to take care of the patient. So I guess it would depend. If one of the choices allows you to use emergency refill rules, so it couldn't be a Schedule II, and it has to be a refill, not a new prescription, I would probably choose that as an answer. But if that's not one of the choices, then I think that maybe they're looking for that strict interpretation that says all refills die with a practitioner. Again, if I was the person choosing questions for Florida, I would not include that question on the exam, but I can't guarantee that they didn't do that. And I have heard from other states and other people who do review courses that it's not addressed anywhere in my state, and students, you know, have said questions about that topic have come up on the exam. So that's a tough one. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the Board of Pharmacy. Now, this is, again, one of the MPJE competency statements, and these are kind of I call them easy questions you don't want to miss, right? These are about how the board is organized and who serves on the board, and they can't be really too tricky on this stuff, hopefully. The one thing you got to remember about the Board of Pharmacy is what their purpose is. And their purpose is not to promote the profession of pharmacy. Their purpose is not to make sure there's adequate jobs for pharmacists. The purpose of the Board of Pharmacy is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. It's a public health and safety job. That should be their purpose. Who's on the Board of Pharmacy is 9 members in Florida. 7 of those members are pharmacists, and 2 of the members are consumer members. And the consumer members can't be affiliated with a pharmacy. They can't be an owner of a pharmacy. They also can't be involved in drug manufacturing or wholesaling. They're truly supposed to represent the public. We're trying to protect the public here. Florida gets very specific on page 100 that at least 2 of those pharmacists have to be in community practice, 2 have to be in institutional practice, and the remaining 3 can be in any particular practice setting. And then number 5 on page 100, Florida, the rules require that at least one board of pharmacy member be at least 60 years of age or older. I used to laugh and make fun of this rule, I guess when I was younger, saying, oh, that's because there's a lot of old people in Florida, so they want to have at least one old member on the Board of Pharmacy. But as I'm approaching that age now, it doesn't seem that old to me anymore. But anyway, that's kind of a unique requirement in Florida. They are appointed by the governor of Florida, and they serve 4-year terms. And they can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms. You will find sometimes some Board of Pharmacy members serve a little bit longer because if their term expires and the governor has not yet appointed a new member, then they're allowed to stay on the board. So I have a friend who served, I think, 10 years on the Board of Pharmacy. So each term got extended by a year before they got reappointed. And they didn't reappoint someone at the last term. So she served 10 years total. On the top of page 101, realize that there is an executive director of the board. The executive director of the board is the administrative head of the board. It's not one of the voting members of the board, and does not even have to be a pharmacist in Florida. And remember that the Board of Pharmacy is part of the Florida Department of Health. Okay. I got a next section on definitions. When you're studying law, Definitions are very, very important. Definitions are really the key to understanding the laws and the rules, because as a lawyer, what I do a lot is I argue about what things say and what they mean. And so when they write laws and they write rules, they got to be very careful about which terms they use. So you can't just skip the definition sections when you're reading the laws and the rules. This is particularly important in Florida because normally you define the terms in a definition section and then you use that term later on and everybody's clear about what that means. But what I found when I was going through some of the definitions in Florida, there are actual requirements in the definitions. So they will add things to, like the definition of the practice of pharmacy, that say a pharmacist shall do this or a pharmacist must do this. That's really not the proper way to write legal definitions, because the definition should define the term, and then later on in the law or the rule that should be where the mandatory requirements are. So it's even more important in Florida to try to read those definitions. So I included some of those for you, and I also want to include some terms in case you're coming from another state that has unique Florida terminology. So a consultant pharmacist in Florida is has to be a certified consultant pharmacist, and we'll talk about that licensing process in a moment. Normally we think of a consultant pharmacist as someone who practices with a nursing home or long-term care facilities, and that's true in Florida as well. However, the term is broad in Florida, and a consultant pharmacist is actually required for any type of institutional practice, which includes hospitals. So a hospital also has to have a consultant pharmacist, not just nursing home practices. So there's a definition of dispense there. And this is a good example of what I was talking about a little bit earlier, is the definition talks about what dispense means, but then it says the pharmacist shall do this as part of the dispensing, which it says talks about interpreting and assessing the order for potential adverse reactions. And the pharmacist shall certify that it's ready for transfer. And the pharmacist shall provide counseling if the pharmacist thinks it's necessary. And we'll cover counseling later, but within the definition of dispense, they've added counseling requirements. So that's a little bit weird to me. And it sounds like it's mandatory there, but we're going to cover the counseling rules later, and you'll see it's really not mandatory. It's only if the pharmacist thinks it's necessary, as it says here under the definition of dispense. And then the rule talks about an offer to counsel, not mandatory counseling. All right. So, and I got that in the note that, there are specific requirements here in the definition of dispense, which is very awkward. Turning over to page 102, we've got medicinal drugs or drugs, and that's a term that can confuse some people. So a medicinal drug, if you see that term in Florida, is a prescription drug. And if you see the term patent or proprietary drug, that's basically an OTC drug. So that can be a little bit different if you're coming from another state. All right, and then we got lots of different types of pharmacies. And so here's where the definitions of them are. There's community pharmacies, there's institutional pharmacies, nuclear pharmacies, special pharmacies, and we'll go through the different types of special pharmacies a little bit later. There's internet pharmacies. Not really a lot of pharmacies fall under this, because if you read the definition, it says locations otherwise not licensed under this chapter that use the internet to communicate with consumers and to fill or refill prescriptions. Well, if you're filling or refilling prescriptions, you're going to have a different type of permit. You're going to have an out-of-state permit, or you can have a community pharmacy permit if you're in the state. So this was an attempt to license, the illegal internet pharmacies. I'd be curious to find out how many pharmacies fall under this category, but just in case they missed anybody, they added this internet pharmacy practice. And then over at 103, just some language that talks about, for any type of pharmacy, that the pharmacy department is considered closed when a pharmacist is not there. They're real big on this in Florida. So when a pharmacist is not present, the pharmacy is considered closed. Now, there's an exception we'll talk about for lunch breaks and meal breaks in community pharmacy, but that's in the community pharmacy rules. And it talks about that there, that you're allowed to go to the bathroom uh, and so forth. But I think what they're trying to get at here is that, you know, if you're in a community pharmacy and let's say it's in a grocery store or something like that, and the pharmacist doesn't show up for work, and can the technician open the pharmacy? Can the store manager of the grocery store open the pharmacy if patients are waiting? No, the answer is absolutely no. The pharmacy department cannot be open unless a pharmacist is present. And the same thing applies in a hospital, institutional pharmacy. Now, we'll see later, there's a specific rule in a hospital pharmacy that allows a nurse or a physician to enter the pharmacy to take a drug for a single dose for a drug for a patient who needs it while the pharmacy is closed, which makes sense. You don't want to deny people treatment in a hospital. But for the most part, nobody can enter the pharmacy. It's considered closed when a pharmacist is not present. And then you got the definition of practice of pharmacy. And again, a fairly long definition of practice of pharmacy. And that's because in any state, the definition of practice of pharmacy is important, because as pharmacy wants to expand their authority to do things, they got to make sure whatever we want to do is within the practice of pharmacy. So if we want to do collaborative practice or provide immunizations or things like that, it's got to be considered part of the practice of pharmacy, even if it's done collaboratively with medical doctors. You want to make sure your definition of the practice of pharmacy is fairly broad, and it is in Florida. And then finally, there's definition of prescription on page 104, and you could read that. And we talked a little bit about that as far as how it applies to out-of-state prescriptions as well. Okay, so let's talk about licensure now. First, we're going to talk about licensure of pharmacists, and there are two ways to get your license as a pharmacist. One is by examination, and that entails passing the NAPLEX and passing the Florida MPJE, which hopefully I'm going to help you try to do that. But you need to read through the specific requirements, and you should know what the internship hours are. In Florida, you have to have 2,080 hours of internship. And on page 105, obviously you have to pass the MPJE and the NAPLEX. It says in the rule you have to have a score of 75 or greater, and it says 75%. That's actually incorrect. It's not 75%. As we talked about in video one, it's 75 on the scaled score. All right, and then you should notice that on letter D on top of page 105, your score is only valid for 3 years. So make sure if you pass the exam, go ahead and complete the process to get your exam. Otherwise, after 3 years, that score is no longer going to be valid. All right, the next way to get your license as a pharmacist is called licensure by endorsement. I put a note there because if most states call this reciprocity, Florida calls it licensure by endorsement. A couple other states call it that as well. There's a lot of history here because for many, many years, there were a few states that did not let you reciprocate or transfer your license from one state to another. In most states, once you pass the NAPLEX, if you want to transfer and you start practicing in a state, and let's say you move to another state and you want to transfer your license to another state, you go through what's called reciprocity. And most states will require you to take an MPJE in their state, but you don't have to take the NAPLEX again. But not every state has an MPJE, but most of them do. And a couple of states have other additional requirements. There's a practical exam that Georgia, I think Georgia still has that. Some states require you to appear before the Board of Pharmacy. I believe North Carolina does that, Oklahoma does that, in addition to taking the MPJE. So for the most part, you know, we don't have a national license yet, but you can reciprocate your license pretty easily from one state to the other if you can pass the MPJE. But for years, there were a couple of states that did not reciprocate their licenses. And they were Florida, Hawaii, and California, all the like nice warm states where people wanted to retire to, right? So because Florida didn't reciprocate and no other state would reciprocate with them. Back in the time when there were pharmacist shortages, I know it's the opposite now. We almost got too many pharmacists. Uh, Chain stores and others were trying to get Florida to reciprocate because they're trying to hire more pharmacists. So they didn't get reciprocation passed, but they got endorsement. But endorsement is pretty much the same as reciprocation. You don't have to take the NAPLEX if you're coming from out of state, but you do have to pass the MPJE. When it was first passed, endorsement required that you'd taken the NAPLEX within 12 years. So, because they didn't want the really old pharmacists coming down, I guess. I don't know. But the 12-year requirement's gone. So anyway, endorsement is similar to reciprocity. It does require, however, that you've passed an NAPLEX at another state, and you either got to show that you've been actively practicing in that other state for at least 2 of the preceding 5 years, or you've just completed an internship within the past 2 years. So if you just graduated, obviously you're not going to be able to have shown that you've practiced for 2 of the past 5 years. Those people can also get their licensure by endorsement. There's another way to do that, and that's by score transfer, and I don't have really time to get into that, but score transfer allows you to take the NAPLEX once and have that score transferred to 2 different states, and it's like getting your license by examination in both states rather than doing a reciprocation or endorsement, which is a good thing to do if you're thinking about maybe going to another state or when you graduate, or maybe doing a residency at another state. Okay. Renewing your license. Licenses in, this is the bottom of page 105, licenses in Florida are renewed every 2 years. It's interesting, they don't space it out. You think they would space it out so not everybody's due at the same time, but they don't. So it's actually September 30th of every odd year. The main requirement to renew your license, as in most states, is continuing education. You have to have your continuing education. So let's talk a little bit about those continuing education requirements starting on page 106. Okay, so the main requirement is every 2 years you have to have 30 hours of continuing education. There's some additional specific requirements that of those 30 hours, at least 10 of those hours have to be live courses or video teleconferences or interactive computer based. So you can get CE through magazine articles back in the day. So back, when I did this, there was no video teleconferences or internet-based CE. So they wanted to make sure that you actually went to some live conferences where you could have some interaction, and didn't do everything by magazine articles. So, but since interactive computer-based are included here, it's probably not that hard to get the 10 hours of live CE. In addition, 2 hours of your CE have to be specifically addressing medication errors, and it's got to be in a program that's approved by the Board of Pharmacy for medication errors. We talked about this next one in the controlled substance chapter, and 2 hours of your CE also have to be validation of controlled substance prescriptions. Now, these are not in addition to the 30 hours, these are all part of the 30 hours. So out of the 30 hours, 10 have to be live credits, and 2 have to be medication errors, and 2 have to be validation of controlled substance prescriptions. Now, if you're providing immunizations or vaccinations, then you have to have 3 hours on safe and effective use of immunizations. And we'll see some other things too. If you are ordering laboratory tests, there's going to be 1 hour of CE related to ordering lab tests. So if you want to do certain special things, then certain special requirements you're going to have to meet. But the general requirement is 30 hours, 10 hours live, and then 2 hours of medication errors and 2 hours of controlled substances. I know when I renew my Florida license, I always got to I always have the 30 hours, no problem. But I always have to find the medication error one and the controlled substance one specifically for Florida. There's also a 1 hour requirement preventing, identifying human trafficking. That's going to be due by January 1st, 2021. That's a one-time requirement, but since it's right now required, I wanted to include that in the book. It's not going to be a continuous thing like the medication errors and the controlled substance one. I got a section there on number 6 on page 106 on what to do when you have your initial license. And it's not quite accurate, so I did update that in the update and corrections document because it's a little bit trickier. And I found this by going to the Board of Pharmacy's website where they explain it a little bit better. So on number 6, initial renewal, make sure you check the update and corrections document. It's a little bit trickier than I thought because even if no CE is required in that initial renewal, they still want you to meet the HIV AIDS requirement and the medication error and validation of controlled substance prescriptions. Oh, I didn't mention the HIV AIDS one. There was legislation a long time ago when HIV AIDS first kind of was a big issue back in the 80s, I guess. And they required all healthcare practitioners in Florida to have CE on HIV and AIDS. And that requirement is still in there, but it's a one-time requirement when you do your first renewal. It's not a continuing requirement. So it's kind of like this human trafficking one, but it's not going to be required every time you renew your license. And again, the HIV AIDS information is in the update and corrections document that you can get off of the website. Turning over to page 107, what counts as continuing education? Like most states, Florida will recognize any course that's accredited by ACPE, the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education. So those are automatically approved for general continuing education. One thing to be careful about when you go to an ACPE course or you take an ACPE accredited course is we talk about how many hours you need. In Florida, you need 30 hours, but ACPE uses something called continuing education units. And I just don't want you to get confused about this. A CEU with ACPE is one credit hour. So if you take a 1 hour course of continuing education, is considered 0.1 CEUs. I don't know why they do it that way, but so technically, if they asked you how many general CEs are required to renew, how many general continuing education units are required to renew your license in Florida, the answer would not be 30, the answer would be 3.0, because again, 30 hours is 3.0 continuing education units. So I put a study tip on there just because I just think they could be tricky on that and something you need to know in practice anywhere. But in addition to a ACPE accredited continuing education course, Florida also lists other ways you can get continuing education. Those are listed for you on page 107. You can get 5 hours of CE related to risk management. If you go to a Board of Pharmacy meeting where they're doing discipline. I guess if you watch other pharmacists get in trouble, that's considered risk management to help you from not getting in trouble. So 5 hours can be done by going to a Board of Pharmacy meeting. There's an interesting one there. You can get credit for volunteer work. 1 hour for every 2 hours of volunteer work to underserved populations or people in critical need within the state. So it's not, I do some volunteer work, but I do it out of the country. So I guess that wouldn't qualify. It's got to be for people in the state. And there's some other ways to get CE that are listed for you that you can read on page 107. And I'll just let you go through those. The last thing is that there is this tripartite committee on page 108 that approves the CE programs. So they don't need to approve an ACPE program because those programs are already automatically approved. But any of these special programs would have to be approved by the tripartite committee. And tripartite it means there's 3 parts, right? And that's because there's representatives on this committee of the Board of Pharmacy, the colleges of pharmacy in Florida, and the professional associations in Florida. So that's where the tripartite committee comes from. So this committee is charged with approving the Florida CE programs. And Some of the big ones that they do are, there's some specialized CE programs that the Board of Pharmacy will impose on pharmacists or licensees as part of the disciplinary process. What happens a lot of times if someone is disciplined by the Board of Pharmacy, in addition to whatever the sanction is going to be, a suspension or paying a penalty or fine, they will often impose a CE requirement that covers two different ones: laws and rules CE, they call it, or quality related events. So a lot of times, if it's, particularly if it's a record keeping violation, or they got in trouble because they didn't know the law, they didn't follow the law, they'll make the pharmacist attend a mandatory laws and rules conference. And those conferences, those CE programs have to be 12 hours. And of course, this program has to be accredited by this tripartite committee. The quality related event continuing education requirements generally will be applied when there's a medication error, because quality related events has to do with risk management and trying to reduce medication errors. So if you read some of the board orders coming out of the Florida Board of Pharmacy in disciplinary cases, you will see they had to pay a fine, they had to do something else, and they had to take a quality related event continuing education course, or they had to take a laws and rules continuing education course. So that's a lot of what the committee does. The other things that they do is that they approved programs for consultant pharmacist certification, which we'll talk about in a moment, because consultant pharmacist has a special certification and additional CE requirements. So any consultant pharmacist program's got to be approved by the tripartite committee of the Florida Board of Pharmacy. Oh, and that's the very next thing. So let's talk about the consultant pharmacist. To get a consultant pharmacist license, it's an additional license that you have in addition to your pharmacist license. And to get and every institutional pharmacy, as we'll see in a moment, has to have what's called a consultant pharmacist of record. And to become a consultant pharmacist, there is a course that you have to go through. And you also must complete a course of no less than 12 hours, didactic course that you got to go through. And then there's sort of this like internship you have to go through. It's called a period of assessment and evaluation. And so where you're working under another consultant pharmacist, and they're kind of showing you the ropes of of what to do in an institutional pharmacy. These rules were written, honestly, mainly for nursing homes and that type of what most people consider to be a consultant pharmacist practice. But remember, hospitals also have to have consultant pharmacists of record. So that part's a little bit interesting. I know the Board of Pharmacy is discussing modifying this rule, because I monitor what's going on at the Board of Pharmacy, obviously, and there's a lot of discussion at the last meeting about this. So this could change in the future, but for your purposes, the rule is as it's written in the book. I think you'll be okay with that. In addition to the extra 12 hours to get your initial consultant pharmacist license and the 40 hours of training or assessment period, you have to do a 3-hour certification if you want to order and evaluate laboratory tests. And then to renew your license as a consultant pharmacist, on the top of page 110, you have to have 24 hours of consultant pharmacist CE. And again, that's approved by the tripartite committee. And that's not part of your regular 30 hours. So there's a lot of continuing education requirements to be a consultant pharmacist in Florida. So you have your 30 hours of general CE plus 24 hours, basically consultant pharmacist recertification is what they call that. Going down to, and to maintain the ability to order lab tests, they have to have 1 hour related to lab tests. I think I mentioned that as well. Then there's a separate rule below that, number 4. I put it under the consultant pharmacist section because the rule was written for consultant pharmacists and doctors of pharmacies. Well, this was written when there weren't that many doctors of pharmacy out there, right? Now everyone's been a doctor of pharmacy, not everyone, but a lot of people are doctor pharmacies, and it said that either consultant pharmacists or PharmDs can order laboratory tests, but this rule was limited really to nursing homes, because again, it was part of the consultant pharmacist rule, but they extended it beyond just a consultant pharmacist to PharmDs. This is another one where you got to make a note, check the update and corrections document, because I think it says in there it was limited to patients in home health. It should be nursing homes. And there's also a correction in number 4B on this page. It says 3 hours of CE to maintain your ability to order lab tests. It's 1 hour to maintain it. It's 3 hours initially and 1 hour to get recertified to order lab tests. So again, make sure you check the update and corrections document on this particular section. Okay. Interns. Interns have to be registered before they're employed in a pharmacy. Things you need to know, I think, on page 111, you have to notify the board within 30 days if you terminate your enrollment in a college of pharmacy or part of an internship program. So anytime there's a notification requirement, I think that's something that you got to pay attention to. 2,080 total hours. There's specific rules on the bottom of page 111. You can only get credit for 50 hours a week while you're still in school, and 60 hours a week after you graduated. Can't work too much to try and get all these credit hours you need to get your license. Okay, pharmacy technicians are registered. They have to file an application. They got to be 17 years of age. They do have to go through an approved training program, and the board has already approved certain programs, like the Armed Services Program, and there are specific rules if you're going to go through an employer-based program. I didn't include those specific rules in there. To renew a technician registration, they also require continuing education. This is on page 112. They have to have 20 hours of continuing education. They also have to have the 2 hours of medication error CE. At least 4 of their hours have to be live seminars or video conferences. Remember, it was 10 hours for the pharmacists, but only 4 for the technicians. They're also subject to the 1 hour program on identifying human trafficking by January 1st, 2021. The one thing that they don't have is the validation of controlled substance prescriptions, because really that's a pharmacist's responsibility and not a technician's, but they do have the medication error CE. And on initial renewal, they have to have the HIV one. So everything's pretty much the same, except for the hours and the hours live, and they don't have to have the controlled substance continuing education to renew their pharmacy technician registration. Okay. There's some additional licenses. There is a specific nuclear pharmacist license. There's a section there about what happens if your license is delinquent, and basically you can't reinstate your license if you forgot to renew it. You can reinstate it if you meet the continuing education and you pay the fees. But if it goes past 2 years, which would be the next renewal period, you can no longer reactivate that license. You'd have to apply for a new license. There's a section on inactive status and how to reactivate from inactive status. I think a lot of pharmacists get confused about inactive status. They think if they want to go in inactive status, it'll save them from having to pay the fee, but at least in Florida, that's not true. And in most states, that's not true. The only reason you want to go inactive status is it comes time to renew your license. And I guess because you're not practicing, you say, well, I'll be inactive. And you don't have your continuing education, because what you don't want to do is lie to the Board of Pharmacy and say, yes, I met my continuing education, and then they check and find out you didn't, because now you're going to be charged with providing false and fraudulent information, and they're really going to be upset about that. So if you're not practicing, it comes time to renew, and because you're not practicing, you didn't get any continuing education, then consider going inactive, and that allows you time to get your continuing education. If you want to activate from the from inactive list, you have to show proof that you've done the continuing education, but you still have to pay the renewal fee. So you're not getting out of not paying the fee. So like for me, I probably could be considered inactive. But do I go inactive in Florida? No. Why not? Because I meet the continuing education requirements. So there's no need for me to go inactive, but I could. Okay. I'm going to skip through the retired license election. You can read that section. And there are some exemptions for on page 114 for members of the armed forces and spouses of members of the armed forces. And a lot of states have done this to make it easier for the military people that obviously move around a lot, that it makes them easier for them to get their licenses. They're exempt from all license renewal provisions, and I assume that includes the fees and the continuing education requirements. So it makes it a lot easier for them to maintain their licenses if they have to move around to different states. Proof of licensure, you know, and display of your license. A lot of times states will require that every pharmacist have their license posted at the place where they work. And you know, some of these pharmacies have a lot of pharmacists that work in them. And now that we register technicians, you'd have a lot of technician licenses. So most states, and including Florida, don't require you that you have your license posted for people to see. But what it says is that you can have a notice that says licenses are available to be viewed. If the public wants to see it, they can do that. You are required to have an identification badge when you work in a Florida pharmacy that identifies you either as a pharmacy technician, a pharmacist, or a intern. Okay. Let's talk about pharmacy permits, because pharmacy permits, Florida has a lot of pharmacy permits. I was looking through the NABP's survey of pharmacy law, and one of the questions they ask is, how many different categories of licenses does your state have? And some states have one. Everybody gets a pharmacy permit. Some states have two. I used to think Texas had a lot. Because we have class A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. We had H. We just got rid of H, which is a lot. Florida lists 18. So my goodness, they have lots of permits in Florida. So it's a little bit difficult, I think, if you're coming from out of state to learn about all these different types of permits. So let's start with the general rules, and I combined, as you'll see there, part of the statute, part of the rule, and Rule 1628. So any operation of a pharmacy requires a permit. Okay, and the application requires lots of things: a sworn application, fingerprints of anybody who owns more than 5% of the pharmacy. There are some exceptions for big corporations that don't have to do that. You can read through that. You have to have a written policy and procedure for preventing controlled substance diversion, basically. We mentioned that in the controlled substance chapter. And you have to have an on-site inspection before you're allowed to open your pharmacy. All right. They do specify, we talked a little bit about a campus registration with DEA, and Florida kind of does the same thing. If you look at number 6, that generally it's going to be one address as it is covered by the permit, but Florida says it can be a bigger area that's a contiguous area, but it can't be more than a half a mile away. So that's a little bit of guide. So hopefully if you could show the DEA that your hospital covers these 5 or 6 buildings, and they're not more than a half a mile away. If your pharmacy permit covers that, hopefully DEA will also say that your DEA registration covers that entire campus as well. Okay. Let's start with community pharmacy permits on the bottom of 115. So any location where medicinal drugs, which are prescription drugs, are compounded, dispensed, stored, or sold, and where prescriptions are filled or dispensed on an outpatient basis. So think of community pharmacy permits as being an outpatient dispensing as opposed to an inpatient type of setting. Every community pharmacy must have a prescription department manager, or PDM is the term used in Florida. Most states call this a pharmacist in charge, a PIC, but the terminology here is a little bit different in Florida. It's a prescription department manager. Then we get to the institutional pharmacy permits. These are the ones that can get a little bit confusing. And The first one is the general requirements are for any healthcare institution, again, where medicinal drugs are compounded, dispensed, stored, or sold. And I think because it includes where they're stored, Florida does something unique, and they actually license nursing homes, which is a little bit unusual because normally when you think of a nursing home, it's serviced by another pharmacy. Most nursing homes don't have their own pharmacy in-house. They're serviced by an outside pharmacy. And when those drugs are sent to the nursing home, they're really considered to be dispensed already. And now the nursing home is the custodian of those drugs, and they may help administer those drugs. But in most states, those drugs are considered dispensed. And in Florida, I think they're considered dispensed as well. But the fact that the nursing home actually stores the drugs, I think causes Florida to give them a license. And that license is a Class 1 institutional pharmacy permit. So what you'll notice if you read the definition of this, it's where medicinal drugs are administered from containers to the patient, and medicinal drugs are not dispensed on the premises. So they're not dispensing them for outpatient use. They've already been dispensed, right, when they were sent to the nursing home. So Class 1 institutional permit is really like for a nursing home, which to me is a little bit unusual. I don't see a lot of other states that license their nursing home separately from the pharmacy that services that nursing home. And you'll see that in the study tip on page 116. The Class 2 permit is really for hospital pharmacies because they provide services on the premises of that institution. So it's generally for hospitals, you think of for Class 2. And we'll talk about Class 3 in a moment, because Class 3 is also can also be hospitals. Class 3 was added a little bit later. And then we've got these modified Class 2 institutional pharmacy permits. And I think there's a lot of history with these, and there's different types of practice settings where they're storing prescription drugs, but they're really not hospitals, right? Or they can't meet all the requirements of hospitals to have a pharmacist there all the time, right? So Florida's approach to these types of facilities, I'll call them, is they call them all modified Class 2 institutional permits. And if you read the definition, that's kind of what it says. It says, well, it's institutional permit, right? But it's short-term primary treatment centers. So it's kind of like a hospital, except they can't meet all the space and other requirements. And one of those big other requirements is they can't really afford to have a pharmacist there all the time, right? So I give you some examples in letter B, things like alcohol treatment facilities, a freestanding emergency room, a surgical center, things like that. So these types of pharmacy permits, institutional pharmacy permits, because they store prescription drugs there, have to have a consultant pharmacist of record, but the pharmacist doesn't have to be there all the time. They have to visit like once a month, just like a consultant pharmacist visits a nursing home once a month. And they have to have policies and procedures about their operations. They may have to contract with another type of pharmacy if they need IVs, right? And we'll talk about those in a moment, special parental enteral extended scope types of pharmacies. Okay. Then they have subcategories of these modified Class 2s, and these are really just based on how many drugs they have, particularly. So type A can have a formulary of not more than 15 medicinal drugs. So a facility that might just need like an emergency kit or something like that. And controlled substances are limited to 100 dosage units. Type Bs can have more of an expanded formulary, and drugs can be stored in bulk. So I would imagine that might be something like an off-site freestanding emergency room or something like that. And then type C also has an expanded formulary. The difference between a B and C is drugs are stored in bulk in a type B, but in a type C, they're stored in patient-specific form. So somebody's servicing that facility, and with unit dose or patient-specific, not even unit dose, it'd have to be like a bingo card or something like that. All right. Class 3, it took me a while to figure this one out, to be honest with you, because this one was added not too long ago. It's for institutional pharmacies that also have central distribution facilities. So I think what the issue was, and I put this in a note on the end of section 5 on page 118, because this is my understanding of why they needed this. There was some interpretations in Florida that a hospital that owned multiple hospitals, right? An integrated delivery system. They had a hospital owned 2 or 3 hospitals. Sometimes they would centralize their pre-packaging of unit dose items in one facility and want to send them to the other facility. And they ran into issues with that because the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, which regulates wholesalers and manufacturers, the Board of Pharmacy doesn't regulate those entities. It's a different agency in Florida. Said no, if a hospital is pre-packaging into unit dose and shipping those non-patient specific medications to another facility, that's drug distribution, and you can't do that if you're not a wholesaler licensed with us. So that became a problem. And there also was some problems with a lot of hospitals serve as 340B, which is a program for I don't have time to get into 340B, but anyway, there are a problem with 340B drugs being sent to off-site locations at these hospitals. So what they did was they went to the legislature and they created a new class called a Class 3 permit that allows a hospital pharmacy to operate just like a Class 2, like a normal hospital pharmacy. But in addition to that, they can do centralized packaging from a centralized location and distribute those products to their other affiliated hospitals, and also takes care of the issue with the 340B program that doesn't run into problems with that. So I would imagine if I'm a hospital, I would just get the Class 3 permit instead of the Class 2, even if I'm not doing that, because in case I decide to do that later, I wouldn't have to switch from a Class 2 to a Class 3. So I know it's a lot of detail there, but that's what the Class 2, if you think of Class 2 and Class 3 as hospital, but the Class 3 can do this additional function of distributing to amongst the hospitals. That's probably what you need to know. Okay, if that wasn't confusing enough, then Florida decided, well, we also need special permits for special types of practices. Okay, so if it doesn't fit under community or institutional or nuclear or internet, we're going to call it a special pharmacy. And then they pass rules to identify what types of special pharmacies they're actually going to recognize and what the rules are. Okay, so the first special pharmacy is on page 119, and that's a special limited community permit. And what this one does, it allows a hospital pharmacy, and it says Class 2, but it should apply to Class 3 as well now, to do a little bit of outpatient dispensing. Because remember, they're only allowed to do inpatient orders, right? You have to be only a community pharmacy can do outpatient. But they say, well, some hospitals may want to fill prescriptions to patients in their emergency room and that are discharged from the hospital. You're allowed to do that out of a hospital, but not more than a 3-day supply, okay? So those are limited 3-day supply. And hospitals are also allowed to dispense to employees and medical staff. Those aren't limited to the 3-day supply, but the ones out of the emergency room or being discharged from the hospital are limited to a 3-day supply. So if your hospital has an outpatient pharmacy and you're only servicing employees and medical staff, you have to get this special limited community permit, or if you're doing the emergency room dispensing. The next type of special pharmacy permit is a special sterile products and special parental enteral compounding rule. Okay, so a pharmacy that's providing IV therapy or enteral products would get this type of permit. Okay, it can be a standalone permit. In fact, my last job in Florida, when I worked as a pharmacist in Florida many years ago, was I worked for a home infusion company. And it's the type of permit we had. And it's the only type of permit we had because that's all we did. We didn't dispense drugs to patients other than enteral and parenteral products. So If your pharmacy does both, if you have a walk-in business where people are having prescriptions filled, you would get a community pharmacy permit for that, and you would get a parental enteral permit if you're doing home infusion or even enteral products to patients. So you would have two different permits. The next one is on the bottom page 119, a special parental enteral extended scope permit. And this one was very confusing. In fact, I made some modifications in the update and corrections document that you should take note of here, because even as I read through this, I couldn't really figure out exactly what was going on here. Because what it says is that it's required for pharmacies to dispense patient-specific parental enteral products. I put to patients in an institutional setting, because my understanding was this was for a pharmacy that is going to prepare IV and sterile products for a hospital or to patients in an institution like a nursing home. And if a hospital didn't have their own IV room, a very small hospital, they could contract with one of these parental enteral extended scope pharmacies to provide that. And that is true, but the language is a little bit broader than that. It doesn't say it's just to dispense for patients in those institutions. It says in conjunction with an institutional permit. And my understanding is, and you'll see this in the update document, so, and this is a change to the note on the top of page 120, it allows institutions like small hospitals that may not have the capability to compound sterile products to contract with a pharmacy with this permit to provide those products to the patients in their hospital. But it also allows the opposite to happen. If you are a hospital, remember, you're only allowed to service your own patients and do inpatient dispensing. If you have a limited community permit in a hospital, you can only do employees of the pharmacy in your outpatient pharmacy, or a 72-hour supply out of the emergency room. But what if a hospital wants to run a home infusion business, and some hospitals have those? This permit allows that as well. So it does two things. It allows a hospital to operate a home infusion operation for maybe, and that is outpatient type of practice, but it also allows pharmacies in the community to service patients in institutions like small hospitals or even nursing homes. Very confusing, right? I know. All right. Then we added letter D, a special sterile compounding permit. So this was done after the New England Compounding Center issue, where obviously all states started to crack down on sterile compounding regulations and outsourcing facilities, and Congress passed a law on that we talked about back in chapter 1. So Florida said, you know, we need to know which pharmacies are actually compounding sterile products. So they created a special sterile compounding permit for any pharmacy or any outsourcing facility that's compounding sterile products. So if you're a hospital and you're making sterile products, you'd have to get this permit. If you're a community pharmacy and you're running a home infusion business, you'd have to get this permit. So you could have multiple permits for a hospital, multiple permits for your pharmacy, depending on what type of services you're providing. So this one is an additional permit, okay, for pharmacies that are compounding sterile products. Now, the only one it would not be required for is that one we just talked about, that special parental enteral extended scope permit, because as we talked about, that one is specifically to allow a hospital to operate a home infusion company service, or a community pharmacy to service a hospital or institutional patient with IV products. So if you have that one, the board already knows you're making sterile products. So they'd have to give you an additional one. So number D3 on page 120 actually, once I thought about it, actually made some sense to me. Okay. Then they got other kind of weird rules that you don't need it in a modified type B class 2 pharmacy if you're only doing low risk products for immediate low risk products as defined under USP 797. Because again, they're really concerned here about an NECC situation where somebody's sending a lot of products out, and it's more medium and high risk types of products. Okay, then there's also a closed door pharmacy permit you can get if you don't have walk-in patients and you're only servicing nursing homes or similar facilities, assisted living facilities, or other types of facilities like that. You can get designated with a special closed door pharmacy permit. And if you have that, it does offer some benefits that you'll see later on, as far as the ability to maybe accept drugs that are packaged a certain way and not used in those facilities. Can actually, if you're in a closed door system, you might be able to return some of those drugs back and reuse them. So that's one of the reasons you might want to get, because you could service these facilities from a community pharmacy permit, but you need this closed door permit if you want to do some of these returns and things like that. And there's other special pharmacy permits for end-stage renal disease facilities. There's one if you're only doing assisted living facilities. And then there's that internet one that we talked about, which again, if you don't fit any of these other requirements and you're doing stuff over the internet where you're dispensing drugs, you would have to get that. I don't think a lot of people have that, but it is in the law. Okay. Other permits, a nuclear pharmacy permit. We'll cover that when we get to the nuclear section back in chapter 4. Non-resident permit. So if a pharmacy is, this is for pharmacies outside the state of Florida that ship or mail deliver drugs to patients in Florida, they have to get a non-resident permit. A non-resident sterile compounding permit is required. Again, because Florida doesn't want to just know the in-state pharmacies that are making sterile products. They want to know the out-of-state pharmacies that are also compounding sterile products. Florida also licenses as pharmacies those outsourcing facilities we talked about in chapter 1. Remember, FDA said if an outsourcing facility is preparing sterile products in a non-patient specific manner, so they're not based on individual prescriptions, and they're really treated more like a manufacturer by FDA. They got to be licensed with FDA. They're expected by FDA. They have to have, under the federal rules, a pharmacist on staff, but they're, in a lot of states, they're not really considered pharmacies because they aren't doing patient-specific dispensing, but Florida has chosen to license them or give them a permit as an outsourcing facility. So the Board of Pharmacy still wants to license those. So make sure you know about the outsourcing facility permit. And then there's an international pharmacy permit that's really not in effect, but I wanted to just mention it there because Florida did pass a law to allow importation of drugs from Canada, and they're awaiting approval from the federal government for that program. It hasn't happened yet. But to get prepared for it in case the federal government does approve that program, they want to license these pharmacies in Canada as international pharmacies to service Florida patients. I don't think it's going to happen, honestly, in my opinion, but the board, since the law passed, and it was a big thing for the governor, he really was pushing this, the board had to pass a rule to have this new type of permit. There's one other permit that I did not include in the book, but, and it's the board does issue permits for animal shelters because they have to have drugs in case they have to euthanize animals and things like that. So that is something that is licensed by the Board of Pharmacy as well. I didn't think it was that important, so I didn't really put it in the book. Okay, so with that, we're going to end this session, and we will start again with chapter 4 with the next video.